And now for our next speaker, Dara McGann from Hostel Worlds.
Hello. Can everyone hear me? Yes, brilliant. So I'm going to walk through my last 5 years in Hostel World, and there's two things that I've learned when you work in testing, and that's number one, death, and number two, when you work in test, you are always the blocker. So very quickly for me, I'm the lead software development engineer in test in Hostel World. I've been there for 5 years. 2017 was a big year for us because we switched from a more waterfall model to a bit of an agile model with Scrum. We changed an awful lot of what we used to do. So we used to depend on data that was already in the databases. We didn't do any setup. We'd run through it ourselves. I love whiskey, very quickly. And if anyone has any really good ports that they'd like to recommend to me, afterwards find me outside while I'm having a cigarette to calm down after this and let me know what they are. For you guys, how many people here are currently working in IT? Shit, that's a lot. How many people are students? Fewer than I thought. How many people are in dev? Developers? That's also a lot. Systems? Small group of you up the back. QA? 3 little groups. Okay. So for the developers, seeing as most of you are here, how many of you at some point in your life said, QA is the blocker? That's a lie. Okay. QA is dead. For 5 years, I've been working in QA, and for 5 years, people have told me QA is dead. How many people here believe QA is dead? 3 people at the front, okay. Death is an unfortunate part of working in QA. Everyone assumes at some point your job will disappear, that developers can test their code better than a QA can. Bullshit. Why do we need QA? We need QA because finding it at the beginning is the easiest way and the cheapest way to fix it. Unit tests can't cover everything. What you need to do is find it in development stage, make sure that it's fixed, and then roll out your solution very quickly. Pete Chestnut has a talk called Make Shift Happen, but when he talks about shifting left, the time that it takes and the amount of work that the amount of cost that it takes to find a bug in production, get a fix, and go through it is about 10 times as much as it will take if you find it when it's in development. You still need QA for this because, like I said, developers can't test their own code. They'll claim to test their own code, but generally they do it very badly. Same thing again, the cost associated with finding the bugs increases astronomically. Why do people want to kill QA? Because QA is the bottleneck. But where did that come from? The traditional way that it worked, and even when we work and go to a DevOps approach or a Scrum approach or an Agile approach where everything happens, the way it works is we plan, we kick it over a wall to dev, the devs take it and they work on it for a couple of days. The devs think this is fucking brilliant, I'm going to release it. They kick it over a wall to QA, QA get it, and QA go, actually, turns out you guys are shit, and they send it back. The step that they don't control is over a wall. How did we fix it? We knew we were the bottleneck 5 years ago when I started in Hostel World. Everybody said to me every fucking day, you guys are the bottleneck. We get our code fixed, our code is shit hot. We give it to you and you guys take 3 days to test it, take too long to test it, it doesn't go out, you're too nitpicky. So what did we do? The first thing I said was, fix your fucking unit tests. Because you're skipping all of this. You're writing unit tests that don't actually test the code, and you're sending it to us and saying, look at this, it's shit hot, it's great. And we go, no, it's not. It's awful. So what we did was Fix the unit tests. We built off the test pyramid, essentially. So we now have integration tests, we now have acceptance tests, and we have UI tests. UI tests, does anyone here work with Selenium? How many people here hate Selenium? Not the same amount. Selenium is buggy as hell, and it's really difficult to get your UI tests work. It's just unfortunate. Next thing we did was we turned it upside down. So test pyramid, test ice cream cone. Manual testing is still a thing and will always be a thing. So I work in automation. You still need manual testers. Computers and code will never find bugs that manual testers will find. You have to do. And the last thing that we did to try and not be the blocker was to automate all the things. Has anyone, I don't know, is anyone a fan of Tesla? The car company? Yeah? So Elon Musk put up a thing about 3 weeks ago. They automated all the things, and they said, we're going to automate all the things, it's going to be great. So they went out and they automated all the things, and they realized we're not hitting targets, we can't ship 5,000 Teslas a month, we're fucked. What did they do? They unautomated all the things and they put humans back in for about 25% of their process. Because you can't automate all the things, but automating all the things up to a certain point can make it a hell of a lot easier. When we work with test code, part of the problem that we have is that developers treat their code as babies. It's precious. You look after it, you put in pull requests, you argue with people for 3 days about whether or not there should be a line break. You look at QA code, QA automation code, and you're like, fuck it, it's just scripting. No? You all look at, don't worry about it, it's fine. QA code is still code. We are partly a blocker because we go through the same processes that you guys go through. So if you are going to spend, as developers, 3 days moaning and bitching about a tab or a space, we do the same thing. So are we a blocker in that sense? Yeah, we are. When we come to the way that we treat test code, you have to look at it as constraints. And this applies to all code, but I'm talking about it in relation to test. There's 5 different ways to deal with constraints, which is identify the constraint, exploit the constraint. Oh no, I thought I had a spelling mistake. Take everything that you're doing and subordinate it to other activities. Elevate the constraint, so know that it's there, and then find the next constraint and repeat the process again. So the first one is identify the constraint. As you can tell, I work in QA. I don't work in design. And you'll see on the next one it gets better. So identify the constraint. This is the constraint, QA. We're the bottleneck. Always the bottleneck. So what do? Exploit the constraint. Again, I'm not in design, that's why there's nothing on the right-hand side. Split the constraint, so move the constraint into 3 or 4 or 5 different parts. If you have one bottleneck, so one single funnel that you run through, that's a big problem. What you need to do is split it out so that you have 5 bottlenecks. I know it's unintuitive, but if you have 5 bottlenecks, it becomes a lot easier to unblock your bottleneck. The second thing that you can do is widen the bottleneck. That's what we did in Hostelworld, was we hired more people. And we threw people at it, and that fixed it, and it was great. Subordinate the constraint. So, the other work of the automation engineers when it comes to Hostelworld is one thing. We work on code. In the same way that developers aren't good at testing their own code because they're not testers, QA should be working on code for us, but automation code. Let them work on their code. Give them tasks that are straightforward and simple. Don't over-engineer a product simply because you want to over-engineer it. Automation infrastructure as code, that's great, we can get there. It makes life a hell of a lot easier for automation because we know what it is that we're dealing with. When we go in and we spend, this has happened to me so many times, especially up until about 3 years ago in Hostelworld, we would go in and we'd start testing something, and I'd go to a developer and I'd go, fuck you, you gave me shitty code. And they'd come back to me and they'd say, It was the environment, because developers are never wrong. But if you can take that and make sure that you know exactly what it is that you're testing and what you're testing on, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to know that what you're testing is right or wrong. And then codify as much as possible. Again, it comes back to the idea of code for automation as code. Treat it as important as you would treat development code that goes into production, because you need to have coding standards. You need to know what it is that you're doing. If you have 10 people on a team and they're constantly arguing about semantics, fuck that, you're not getting code done. And the biggest job of what it is that we do is to ship it out the fucking door. Sorry. Elevate the constraint. Again, I am definitely not a designer, and I'm realizing there's a lot more looking through this presentation. Elevating the constraint is that it's about identifying the constraint, making sure that it's there and working towards trying to fix it. How many people here have ever looked, how many of the developers here, because like 90% of you are developers, have said you're the bottleneck, but how many of you have tried to work with QA to unblock them? Bullshit. Absolute bullshit. When you identify the constraint, you look at it and you want to say, I'll help you unblock. So you'll go and you'll say, what's the problem? How can I help you? What can I do? How can I fix it? Send it back to me. I'll get it out. It'll be quick. It'll do this. It'll do that. No. What you need to do is identify where the problem is. Instead of just fixing it, find out what the actual problem is. Because if you just send the code back, you fix it, and then you ship it back out again, how did it get there in the first place? The constraint that's there is QA. I'm the first person to admit that the problem is QA, because we've found it, we've gotten there. But the failure of QA was not moving further to the left-hand side of the model. You guys should identify that this is the problem, but identify it when it's in dev. Realize that this is where the issue is going to be and move it through. So you're always funneling. Next one, find the next constraint and kill it. Essentially the same thing. The first thing to do is, especially when it comes to constraints, there's little things that will help. You've all said, half of you have said now that you've gone to QA and said, how can I help you? How can I unblock you? How can I do stuff better? There's a lot of really low-hanging fruit that you can do there. When you're writing your unit tests, call over a QA and ask them what they test and see if you can do something there. Work towards simple, small tasks first, and then identify the bigger problems, because you'll realize that if you can cut off 20 small tasks first before going for the big problem, which is I want to kill QA and I just want to ship it out the door, but smaller tasks mean that you can unblock quicker and in a smaller way. Communication and visibility is kind of the whole part of it. Like I said there, people have said they've helped to unblock QA. Communication within development or within your entire development teams or everybody that's there is absolutely vital to the success of getting rid of constraints. Half the time, for me, part of the problem is that devs will be working on something, they'll take a ticket, they'll say they're doing something, but they forget to mention at the bottom of it, oh, by the way, I did this really big fucking thing that I didn't tell you about. And you realize that after you get it. Now, it doesn't always happen, but you'll see once a month there's always that one person on one team who's a dickhead, who likes to put in stuff because he thinks it's really cool, but he doesn't tell anyone that he's done it. How many people have worked with somebody like that? I'd say probably more, but anyway. I think these people exist everywhere. Communication and visibility is the biggest part of it. You need to know what people are working on. You need to know what your devs are working on. For QA, we need to know what you're doing. But you also need to know what QA does. How many people here think they know what QA does? 1, 2. I'm going to say bullshit again, so you can put your hands up and I was going to say it. But you need to understand the way that both people work. So everybody in the organization needs to know what everybody else is doing. But you don't need to just know to be nosy. You don't need to know because you like to just look at shit. You need to know and understand what it is that they do, because if you understand what their problems are, You can help them to unblock it because it's usually your fault. Visibility of work, this comes back to the same thing again. 90% of the time, work that comes through, everyone thinks that they're doing exactly what's on the ticket. They think that they're sticking to the work, or sorry, they're sticking to the task that they've been given. The vast majority of the time, work that's actually being done is only about 15% of what's being done during a day. The rest of the time, people aren't really working. People are spending time causing problems for themselves. So you sit there for 8 hours a day behind the desk as a developer, sitting there coding, doing work. How much of that time is actually writing code and then pushing it? Very little, in my opinion. But then again, I'm a QA who thinks you're all really problematic, but anyway. But visibility of work, you have to understand that people don't come in and work like robots for 8 hours a day. The actual work that you're doing is probably going to make up 20% of it. But that 20% of the time that you're working, make sure that people know what that work is. Communication, I come back to communication again, because communication, especially in IT, because most of us don't like to talk to each other. We like to send messages on Slack or Teams. Get into a fucking room and talk about it. Say what's going on. Talk about what you're working on. Yes, we do a daily stand-up and we say what we're working on. Most of the time, people come into those daily stand-ups, they're half asleep. They don't really care. I don't really want to know what other people are working on. That's the method that you get into it. If you look, especially with daily stand-ups are done and they're part of Agile, they're part of Scrum. They have to be done, yes. Most of the time, people don't give a shit when they come in. This is a box-ticking exercise. So make sure that it's easy to sit down, simple interactions, and actually care about what's going on. It takes 15 minutes of your day at most, but talk to other people. Communication is the biggest issue that you will see in most companies. And again, like I said, rather than talking to somebody on Teams or Slack or chatting, sending an email, go over and tap the person on the shoulder and ask them a question. Pick up the phone and call them. I had an incident about 6 months ago where we spent 3 days, somebody was back and forth with me in Dublin. It took 3 days to resolve an issue. When I picked up the phone and called them, I had the issue resolved in 15 minutes. Back and forth, you don't get the full idea. You can't see the person, you can't talk to, you're like, what the fuck are you working on? I don't really get this. Send me on this. Give me a link to the repo. 15 minutes, it was fixed. Took 3 days before I picked up the phone and said, fuck, I'll pick up the phone, give them a call and see what happened. 15 minutes, it was fixed. And then part of the thing with communication is feedback loops. So feedback loops are probably some of the most important parts. Obviously, you probably all know this, but communication has to happen all the time and in real time. So, did I put arrows on this? Yeah. The way that I see feedback loops and the role of QA as I see it for what my job is and for what I do, communication is the QA is the facilitator of communication between all of these parts. So devs and systems, QA is the facilitator. Product and dev, QA is the facilitator. The people in your organization who will know your product best isn't your product people. It's your QAs, because they work on it every fucking day. And we hate the product. When you spend 3 years looking at the same bugging website. Anyway, I'm getting close to the end. So most of you have probably sat there and been like, what the fuck is he talking about? He's just rambled for 19 minutes and 10 seconds. But QA isn't the issue. QA is a bottleneck, and I'm the first person to say that QA is a bottleneck. QA, you're always going to want to kill it. People will talk about killing QA for the next 50 fucking years, and we won't die. Because you don't want to admit it, but you guys need us. Because, like I said, you're really shit at testing your own code. Everyone's a bottleneck. If you can take two things away from this talk, which is very little because it's just rambling, but two things away from the talk. The first of which is communication is the biggest problem that you'll face in any organization. Talk to your QAs, talk to your other devs, make sure that you're talking, and as much as possible in person. The second part of it is QA is necessary, but it's a pain in the arse. But it is necessary. But if you do your job right, you can make it a lot easier because everyone is a bottleneck, not just QA. So, yeah.
So, any questions for the immortal QA? Over there.
Just before you ask your question, your beard is fucking amazing.
Thank you.
Now, be nice. I was nice to you.
I'll be nice. I do feel the same pain you mentioned, that when you have like brick walls, you have the development stage, you pass it on to QA stage, and I don't care, my job here is done. And it becomes troublesome because QA guys take some time to test it. The end of the sprint or the end of the deliverable is this Friday. I shipped it on Friday afternoon, so you have to test it. It goes back and we can deliver it. It's an ongoing problem. I get that communication is vital here. I just wanted to ask you if you have any practical advice on not separating both stages. So how would you include more QA during the development phase? And that includes communication as well, but if you have any practical advice on things you've tested in which you don't have that much focus on, now this is development, now this is QA. It's more of a mixed thing. So everybody's on board, like if this is going to QA, it's probably going to get pushed through the first time.
So those walls that I was talking about earlier, the easiest thing to do is to break down those walls. But every time that you hear, like, there's a different framework or a different culture. Agile is great. DevOps is going to kill Agile. DevSecOps is going to kill DevOps. Actually, no, we're going to call it fucking Christmas and do something else. Those walls, I did close enough to this talk about 2 months ago here in Porto, and somebody turned around to me and they're like, "You're very old-fashioned the way you think," because those walls don't exist anymore. And I told them to fuck off.
They do.
But those walls always exist, no matter what you're working in, because there will be that mindset of just kick it off the wall. Like you said, sprint is finished on Friday afternoon. Friday at lunchtime, I pushed the code and released it. My job's done. The easiest way to get around that is the three things that I said there. So communication obviously is one of the things. Bring QA in earlier on in the process. So what we try to do in Hostelworld is that once we know that there's a new endpoint or there's a change to the website or whatever it is there, I have sat down with designers and said, when you're designing this, I need this tag. I can write the test now. So TDD does help with that.
Exactly.
Once you know the test first. So test first, you have it there. So it means when you release it, it's ready to be tested straight away. And then you should have a pipeline that will quickly get it past it. But I think involving QA earlier on in the process is the biggest thing. Communication, again, is the biggest thing. But I suppose the true answer to your question is you're not going to break those walls. Those walls will always exist, no matter how much someone here, someone in Dublin, has told me these walls don't exist in their company. They're talking absolute horseshit, because they do. But you just can't see them and they're not as visible as they used to be.
It's more like turning a brick wall into a fence,
yeah.
I guess.
Yeah, essentially. What we've done is we've reduced the size of the wall and we've made it easier to see between the stages. And the stages still exist. But we've made it easier to see over the wall. Instead of just kicking it over, we can now see it there and we pass it over the wall. But there's still a divide. And you have to accept that, in my mind, or in my opinion, you always have to accept that there is that wall, and that wall will always exist to a degree. But all you can do is make the wall smaller. You're never going to get rid of it, as far as I think. Other people here will likely disagree with me, and I've learned that over time. But I'm a bit of a pessimist, so I'm used to that.
Cool. Thank you.
Anyone else? Probably they feel they need to have a beard before they do a question. No questions? Over there. The system is working. And yes, TDD is the answer for almost everything. We are fast-tracking the process.
So, one of the things that, by your talk, I think may happen is that by having this culture of, yeah, the developer fucked up and I'm gonna fix it, and then you fuck up again, and you have like these bands of people that hate each other. So that's what I think that should not happen. And I'm a believer more in a TDD approach to that than towards this kind of bunch of people trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
So how do you fight that? So as for what you said, I think you're more on a, at this moment on a kill each other mode more than a let's
We're
work
actually
together.
not that bad. I'm just more of a, I'm Irish, so I'm angry.
Yeah, but I'm not pointing just towards you, but I think it's happened frequently.
Yeah. No, culture is a big thing now, especially in Hostelworld. About 3 years ago, we decided to try and change the way that we were working to go from this. You kick it over the wall, but the way it used to be was you kick it over the wall, and then you'd sit there with a sniper rifle and shoot them. So it was very standoffish. The way that people work, like obviously, I'm assuming most of you have probably taken away from this that I'm quite a brash individual and I like to use the word fuck a lot. So when I was like that, I would give that back to the devs, I'd give that to systems, I'd give out to everyone. I still do give out to everyone. It's kind of my nature. But if you take a culture of people who are very open and can get into it, so for me, the way that I work on my team, other teams are different inside Hostelworld, but my team is very, very open to criticism, and we're incredibly vocal about our criticism. And we have a little angry Kiwi who is worse than me, and he uses fuck twice as much as me. But that's our culture in our team. We accept that that's the way that we are. We're standoffish with each other, but at the same time we understand that we're all there to do one thing, which is ship releasable, testable, functioning code. For the other teams that I have people in my team who are on the other squads, they're a lot more nicer than me. So don't take everything that I've said here as standoffish. We have a lot of really good automation people in Hostelworld who just go into a team and they will run it. They don't fight, they don't argue. They're there in the culture and everyone wants to collaborate and work together and get it out. So what I'd say to you is that there's no single solution for what it is that's happening, but if you're working in a group of people like I am, who are standoffish or their mentality would be that they work in this way, the way that I do, leave them work that way. But just make sure that it doesn't bleed out of that team into a team that doesn't work that way. Or if you have another team that work really well together, they're very collaborative, they can talk to each other, they're nice, they never use the word fuck, leave them to work that way as well. But don't expect the team over here with the angry Kiwi and the drunk Irish guy to work with the unicorns and ponies. Do you know what I mean? So what I'd say is just let everyone be them and make sure that people can find their own teams that they work well in.
I think that's it.
Cool.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.